Oh, shit. Here we go again.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's your brother Leafy was here, and today we have part 2 of my series of lectures refuting Orientalism. Inshallah, in today's part, we're going to be refuting Quranic studies, going in depth into that, what has been the progress in Quranic studies from the Western perspective, what are the blunders that they've made, just a few of them, and how do we approach their methodology. All right. So with that being said, make sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and without further ado, let's get straight into it. So favoring Euro-American approaches and interpretations of the Quran pervades the field to the extent that many of the revered studies of the Quran in the Western academic tradition have failed to take account of the cumulative development of knowledge that lies at the heart of the academic enterprise. Even factual evidence that would complicate contemporary theories is all too often either explained away or willfully ignored. And I'll give some examples of this. For example, Harold Motsky, who's a Dean of Islamic Studies, has demonstrated that when John Wansbrough, who's a revisionist scholar, was confronted by hadith collections which complicated his theory that traditions regarding the compilation of the Quran did not arise until the 3rd Islamic century, so that would be the 9th century, Wansbrough chose to rewrite history by asserting that the collections in which these traditions occur were not really compilations by their putative authors, but by their pupils or by later generations, rather than modify his own theories. Essentially what's going on here is you have a scholar named John Wansbrough, and he published a book. He's part of the 1970s revisionist camp of Crone, Cook, and Wansbrough, and he published a book called Islamic Studies, and in it he opens the door to revisionism. This is the revisionist renaissance of the Islamic studies. And he came with this hypothesis or theory called the Wansbrough hypothesis, which stated that the Quran is not actually the work of one author, the Prophet Muhammad, or, it doesn't actually go back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but instead is the work of multiple authors. And it's not actually in the 7th century, as the Muslims say, but it was actually made and compiled in the 9th century, right? Same thing for the hadith. So the hadith doesn't actually go back to the Prophet, it's all back projected, and the hadith actually is also a later invention of later Muslims, right? It's all back projected. This is what these scholars say. And this discourse comes from their own tradition, their own trauma, where they found out that their own history, their Western history, was not as they thought it was. For example, they discovered through historical critical scholarship of the Bible that the sayings attributed to Jesus were not actually authentic. Jesus never claimed to be God. He never preached a Trinity. So there's a disconnect between the historical Jesus and the Jesus of, for example, the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, or what is, the commonplace Jesus, right? Or the common depiction of Jesus. There's a real disconnect there. And when they realize that they've been duped in terms of their own history, and that their religion, has fabrications and concoctions and back projections, they basically took that trauma and tried to back project it onto other religions. So they said, look, well, if this happened with our history, it must have happened with all histories. Therefore, Islam, their primary sources must also not go back to the Prophet. And that's generally the reasoning. So any kind of later rationalization, any kind of later argument is just a ad hoc explanation of this. Fundamentally, this is the reasoning, is that it happened to us, therefore it must be true for them as well. Right? So this kind of trauma dumping, this is what we call it, trauma dumping. You're taking your own trauma from your own history and trying to project it onto other histories, is embodied by John Wansbrough, where he tries to say that the hadith collections were not early and not authentic. But then when Motsky does a rigorous study of these hadith traditions and finds that they actually are early and oftentimes do go back to the companions, at least through isnad kun meta-analysis, which we're going to get to later, what that is and how that works. He basically shows that it's authentic. Instead of conceding the point and going where the evidence leads, he just chooses to ad hocly say, like, look, these traditions don't actually go back to their putative authors, but instead they go back to, generations later on who also back projected it. So again, you can't win with these people, basically. They have a preconceived narrative and they'll fit the evidence around that narrative instead of just taking the evidence on face value and seeing whether or not it conforms with the traditional narrative. So there's many examples of this, and I'll get to a few more as well. Another example of this is Christopher Luxembourg. Now, What he did is provide a more audacious reading of the Islamic textual history, one which required that the foundations of the Arabic language itself were not known to the Arabs, but only discovered by Luxembourg with help from his team in the late 20th century. Luxembourg's reading leads him to declare that the entire scholarly edifice of Islam, largely based on the reliability of oral tradition, is unfounded. So Luxembourg, what he did is publish a book called the Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran, in which he argues that a lot of the Quranic readings or the Quranic text was actually written in Syro-Aramaic or come from Syriac instead of Arabic. Now, this is contrary to the Islamic narrative. It's contrary to the linguistics. It's contrary to the manuscript evidence. It's contrary to literally everything. Every point of data that we have disproves his hypothesis. And his methodology is critiqued by pretty much every scholar who's, worth his salt. That's actually, fair and reasonable. Like, for example, Neuwirth, Angelica Neuwirth, the German scholar. She criticizes him and says his methodology is unsound. So does Nicholas Sinai. So do pretty much every other scholar. But what the point shows is that in each of these examples, the theory demands the exclusion and reconfiguration of large swaths of data in order to fit a preconceived narrative, where they already have a narrative of what must have happened, and they just try and fit the evidence to be in line with that preconceived narrative instead of looking at it objectively. Another example of this that is even more outrageous is in David Power's book, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men. So what he does, I'll just read from Lumberg here, which in theorizing collective international linguistic amnesia to advance a theory of forgery in the Quran requires that we ignore basic principles of paleontography, linguistics, and histography. Each of these works exhibits an extreme example of a prevailing tendency in Euro-American scholarship to declare interpretive frameworks that arise from within the Islamic tradition invalid in order to aggregate to the authors of the Euro-American tradition the primary or even sole authority for theoretical production. Essentially what Dr. Lombard is saying here is that David Powers is trying to say that there was mass amnesia, such that no one even remembered what was being forged and what is not being forged. Now, in a society that is primarily oral, this is unthinkable. Right. This is completely against pretty much all the data that we know about oral traditions and how they work and oral memory. To say that there's mass amnesia is really a really big stretch, and it's kind of laughable at how bad of a theory that is. But it's not surprising that these revisionists go towards they have to resort to such extreme understandings or extreme accounts of Islamic history, and he's not alone in this. Don't think that I'm cherry picking here or that Dr. Lombard is cherry picking here, because a lot of these people will actually say the same thing. For example, Joshua Little, who I made a video on refuting, which if you guys haven't seen that video, definitely check that out. He also believes in this mass amnesia theory. He believes, for example, that Aisha radiallahu anha didn't know her own age, and it's not because she's forgetful or people didn't keep track. It's because no one knew their own age. And there was no semblance of chronology. There was no keeping, age-keeping practices. There was mass amnesia. He genuinely believes that. Now, that's historically absurd and untenable. And yet, these revisionists will, with a straight face, tell you that this is historical critical scholarship. Genuinely, I'm not making this up. Following Wansborough's lead, Ripon claims that the material provided by the Tafsir and Sirah does not provide historical records, but simply the existential records of the thought and faith of later generations. As Angelica Neuwirth observes regarding those who take this revisionist approach, she says, quote, "Constrained by their revisionist preconception, these scholars assume that the historical reality is so deeply warped that today it is impossible to discover any exact information concerning the early history of Islamic scripture. Thus, not only was the idea that an original community had emerged from the Hijaz assigned to the realm of a pious fiction or a pious legend, but any attempt to undertake a microstructural review of the text and the history of its growth was branded as meaningless, and thus that endeavor was abandoned." Now, this really says volumes. Now, Angelica Neuwirth is not Muslim, nor is she a Muslim apologist. She's a genuine critical scholar. She's interested in getting to the roots of what actually happened. And if you read her work, and I have read her work, that's generally the impression you get from reading her. She's even noticing that, look, this revisionist preconception, it's too much. How can you peddle things that are so patently untrue? and yet, branded as scholarship. She's noticing this issue as well. But not only is she noticing the issue with the evidence or the use of evidence, it's the lens or the methodology of the revisionist that is of her primary concern. The idea is that because we lied about our history, the Muslims must have also lied about their history. And you'll see this assumption expressly stated. Or oftentimes it'll be a subtle subtext in the work of these supposed critical scholars, where they'll say, look, for the critical historian, their job is not to, get to the truth of the matter. That's what they would say, but really that's not what it is. It's to reconstruct history with the assumption that the people who are telling you that history are lying to you. They're always lying to you. And they could never actually tell you the truth. So they might have a little bit of truth, but that truth is always hidden within a lie or an agenda. So the scholars are trying to deceive you. So, for example, you get this in the video that I made with Joshua, where he says that, Al-Juzajani is he's trying to deceive you, and there's no evidence for this. It's just his assumption. His assumption is that, Al-Juzajani is trying to deceive you. And it comes from this idea that our scholars deceived us, our tradition deceived us, they were clueless, therefore the same thing must apply to the other traditions, including the Islamic tradition. Therefore, this whole method, it stems from that assumption. Now, that assumption is seldom ever challenged, but generally that's what it is, because before even looking at the evidence, they come with that assumption that we should be doubtful towards Muslim sources and that Muslim scholars are trying to deceive us when telling their history. So Al-Tabari is trying to deceive you, Ibn Kathir is trying to deceive you, Ibn Taymiyyah is trying to deceive you. None of them have the intention of actually relating their tradition honestly. Instead, they're all trying to, embellish it or change it for their own, socio-economic goals. That's basically the assumption. Now, they have no evidence for this, except for, some, that's not to say that there weren't, embellishments in the tradition and in the seerah. There were, and the muhaddithin catch these embellishments. That was actually their job, right? So that shows sincerity on their part. But yet, even with that being the case, and even with them knowing that, they still choose to believe, no, these muhaddithin were still clueless, and they were still in on it, in on this conspiracy. This is all a performance. I'm not joking. I'm not, joking when I say any of this. That's genuinely what they believe. Much of Euroamerican scholarship on the Quran begins with the assumption that an historical and indeed Arabian context for the Quran cannot be recovered from the primary sources, as they are too deeply dented by pious law and political embellishment. In this vein, Gabriel S Reynolds, who's a supposed scholar, but really he's an apologist and, just a joke, Brother Dean is posting about on his Twitter. He has a nice thread refuting him that I'm also helping him with, so definitely make sure to check that out if you haven't already on Brother Dean's Twitter. He argues that the Quran, from a critical perspective at least, should not be read in conversation with what came after it, which is the tafsir tradition, but instead with what came before it, which is biblical literature. So Reynolds derides the use of tafsir by scholars such as Watt, Neuwirth, and Abd al-Halim. Then, based upon the hypothesis of Burton, who posited that if one can imagine a theological motivation for a report, the report cannot be historically true. Reynolds concludes that the historical accounts provided by the commentators can be a proper guide for a pious reading of the Quran, but to the critical scholar, they should suggest that tafsir is a remarkable literary achievement to be appreciated on its own right. These tafsir traditions do not preserve the Quran's ancient meaning, and to insist otherwise does a disservice to both the tafsir and to the Quran. Essentially what he's saying is, look guys, you Muslims, that tafsir tradition, it's cute, right? But it doesn't actually, represent what the Muslims actually believed, or, the proper meaning of the Quran. It's just what you guys made up later. Now, who the hell is this guy to say that? What kind of authority does he think he has? Because you have a degree from some Western university, now you think you can tell us about our own tradition? The amount of arrogance is, it's laughable, to say the least. Especially when you consider this guy's lack of knowledge and that he's a, paid propagandist. Now, this guy's like a liberal bot. Gabriel S Reynolds, if you've actually read any of his works, he has so many blunders that, if I wanted to start talking about it, the lecture's already going to be long enough as it is. But I'd refer you guys to Brother Dean's video refuting Gabriel S Reynolds, and also his Twitter, where he's going to be going more in depth, breaking down Gabriel S Reynolds and his various blunders in terms of intertext and other issues, which exposes his pseudo scholarship. So, on this quote by Reynolds, Lombard comments. He says, one wonders how it can be a disservice to the scholars of the classical commentaries to claim that the history and philology they sought to discern and to preserve should be reduced to, quote, literary achievements that do not in fact serve to preserve and convey the Qur'an's ancient or original meaning. Given more recent developments in the field, it is also surprising that one would cite Burton. Now, Burton is another one of these revisionists. As Sadaghi and Bergman have demonstrated, the manuscript tradition, which is the most objective evidence we have, indicates that Burton's thesis regarding the collection of the Qur'an during the Prophet's life is not supported by the available material evidence. Again, the revisionist theories are debunked. They say, quote, manuscript evidence now corroborates pre-modern reports about the existence of companion codices, their having different surah orderings, and to an extent, the nature of the verbal differences. Conclusively refuted is John Burton's theory that all such reports were post-Uthmanic fictions aimed at countering, elucidating, or even evading the Uthmanic text. This is what Burton believed, that these reports were all post-Uthmanic fictions. But now we know that that's not the case. The Sirah, the Hadiths, are actually in concordance with the manuscript evidence. Now, this is itself an argument for the authenticity of Hadith, because if Hadith were mass fabricated or forged, or the scholars didn't do a good job at preserving the authenticity, then how is it that the variations that we have mentioned in Hadith concord with the manuscript evidence? Clearly, they must stem from an ancient memory that is original to the companions, which means that the Hadith were preserved. Nicholas Sinai, who's another Orientalist scholar. Now, again, he's one of the fairer ones. I don't agree with all of his views, but he's definitely miles away from, the revisionism of Liddell and Shoemaker and Crone and these guys. So he's in what I would call the neo-traditionalist camp, where he takes the general outline of the Islamic sources to be true, and he says there could be, minor embellishments, details, etc., that are not historical, just as the case with any other record, any other historical record. But overall, it's reliable. The structure is at least reliable as far as we can reconstruct. Talking here about the preservation of the Quran, in his article, "When did the continental skeleton of the Quran reach closure?" He says 650, and he gives reasoning. I'll read what he says. He says, a similar case is Quran chapter 3 verse 96, according to which the first house of worship that was founded for humankind is that in Becca. Islamic exegetes generally propose that the expression Becca is a variant for Mecca, yet are forced to reconstruct rather intricate derivations of the expression Becca in order to make the point. What would have been by far the simplest way of remedying the problem, and presumably one on which all major Islamic confessions should have been able to agree, namely to change the ba into a meme. But this was apparently not practicable anymore by the time people started paying serious attention to the verse. In the Hebrew Bible, too, anomalous or obscure expressions and place names have frequently been retained, but there they have also given rise to interpretive glosses inserted to the text, which are conspicuously absent from the Quran. So what he's saying is, so first of all, I want you to notice the framework. These Orientalists are always comparing the Quran to the Bible, even though really there is no comparison. They're completely two different textual traditions at all. The textual criticism of the Quran is completely different to that of the Bible, where you don't even have the original, you have no idea. But with the Quran, we know what the original was with a high degree of certainty. We can trace it back very well. So just notice the framing first. With that being said, even though you can see he's still in the framework of Orientalists, he's still being relatively fair, because what he's saying is that, look, if the Muslims wanted to change something, surely they would have they wanted to change the continental skeleton of Uthman, the Rasm. What they would have done is change the ba to a meme, because that would solve the issue. That would solve the issue of the exegetes trying to derive where did this root word Becca come from. They'll just say, look, it's not Becca, it's meant to be Mecca. Right? But they didn't do that. Right? He calls this a textual shock freezing. So he says, the textual shock freezing indicated by examples such as the above is most easily explained as the early Islamic community's reaction to the death of a charismatic messenger who had been the sole person endowed with the authority to publish and modify divine revelations. In any case, it stands to reason that if Al-Hajjaj or if anyone else had revised the text at around 700, even on a very minor scale, passages such as the above should have been the first to be amended, which would merely have required exchanging single letters and might therefore have occurred almost instinctively. So the revisionists, like, for example, Shoemaker, Donner and others, these guys believe that someone named Al-Hajjaj is the one who canonized the Quran, and he did this around the year 700 on the orders of Abd al-Malik bin Marwan. And this is a far-fetched revisionist theory that's been refuted countless times. But yeah, and Joshua Little used to believe this, but he changed his mind on this a few years ago. But nonetheless, it shows you the kind of absurdity that these people have to go to. And here Nicholas Sinai is refuting them, saying, look, if you want to posit that someone else, revised the Quran at the year 700, going against the traditional narrative, you have to show that. You can't just assume that. And if they did, then why didn't they change Bakka to Mecca? Surely that would have been the first change. And we have examples of this in the Hebrew tradition, in the biblical tradition. So again, that just refutes their idea. He says in his conclusions, one must admit that the argument at the end of the preceding section is not assailable, meaning the argument that Al-Hajjaj or anyone else canonized the Quran after Uthman. Firstly, we can be sure that there might not have been more passages of the sort presented above that were corrected. Secondly, even if it is conceded that most of the Quranic corpus must have been extant before Al-Hajjaj and that the latter did not correct existing portions of the text, does this rule out the insertion of new material? In other words, can we rule out that the Quran might have constituted a literary corpus which was textually stable yet could still be added to? Such objections obviously raise a burden of proof dilemma. Should we require proponents of the conventional view that the standard rasm of the Quran had become fixed by 650 to produce conclusive evidence of the absence of later traditions, or should we instead require the scholars insisting on the possibility of later editions to prove that such editions do in fact exist? He is saying is, look, if you guys want to claim that there were any post-Uthmanic assertions or additions or interpolations in the Quran, what should we do? Should we require the people who believe the traditional narrative to try and prove the absence of these insertions, or should we require the people making the claim to have the burden of proof? He says, I would submit that the latter position is more reasonable. If the only swans we have encountered are white ones, it is the proponent of the existence of black swans whom we may legitimately expect to argue his case. Similarly, as long as no Quranic passages with a distinct style and terminological profile have been compellingly placed in a late 7th century context, the traditional dating of the standard rasam to 650 or earlier ought to be our default view. So again, he agrees with the traditional narrative and says, look, you guys really don't have any evidence for a later dating. And until you do, there is no reason for us to assume a later dating or an interpolation or anything of that kind. And this is Nicholas Sinai, and this is his specialty.
So what I'm going to do now is just play a clip from Jonathan Brown's lecture refuting Gabriel S Reynolds on this point and just exposing the level of stupidity and incompetence of these revisionist scholars. And once you understand this is how these revisionists think and how they rationalize things, then you'll understand why the Western approach to the Islamic sciences is a joke.
I wanted to show you just an example of, and then I'll be done, an example of how this actually works in the study of the Islamic tradition. Now, if you guys remember a couple years ago, there was the Birmingham Quran debate. There are these pages from a mushaf that were in the Birmingham University Library, and there was carbon testing done on them, and the carbon testing put them between 668 and 645. And the first, some people were saying this was actually like during the time of the early caliphates. Okay, now this is actually an article written by a Western scholar who teaches at University of Notre Dame named Gabriel S Reynolds. I think his family's Lebanese Christian. And I want you to think about this, right? The idea here is when does the Quran originate? So the general, prior to this, a lot of historians who are really skeptical of Islamic history said that the Quran was a later construct that was put together in like the 700s or even 800s of the Common Era. Things like this radiocarbon dating and a lot of other early Quranic pages that have been found really put a rest to this. But now look what happens. The fact that the date is 568 to 645, Gabriel S Reynolds writes, the upshot of all these early dates is that the Quran may very well date earlier than Uthman, perhaps much earlier. Ooh, what does that mean? It may be time to rethink the origins of the Quran's, or think the story of the Quran's origins. Sorry. It may be time to rethink the story of the Quran's origins, including the traditional date of Muhammad's career. So I want you to think about this, right? What is the Muslim claim? The Muslim claim is that the Quran comes from the time of the Prophet. So 610 to 632, and then around 650, the Caliph Uthman promulgates the official version of the Quran. So 610 to 650. That's the claim. Now, think about this. Why is that so hard to believe? You can believe that and still be an atheist. You can say this was all made up. Muhammad wrote it himself. Someone else wrote it. I don't know. You can be an atheist. You can deny its divine revelation. You can do whatever you want. But the only claim being made here is that it comes from this time period. But note, it's just that can't be accepted. Either it has to be a lot later, or now if we get these dates, it must come from earlier. In fact, maybe it comes from before the life of the prophet. Here's a quote from, or I wrote this in one of my articles. I just pasted it here for you to see. A number of scholars who have interest in early Islamic history, particularly the popular author Tom Holland, have stated that the carbon dating of the Birmingham Quran pages suggests that the Quran actually predates the life of Muhammad. In fact, he argues it suggests that the Quran dates from a good deal before Muhammad's career. Just think about this, right? What these people are saying is either the Quran is much later invention, or it comes from before what we think Islam's origins are, but it can't come from the time that Muslims say it comes from. Why is that unacceptable to these people? And this is why you have to understand psychology, the mindset that comes out of the historical critical method and its origins. Orthodoxy is a later creation. So whatever the religion officially says is not the original story, it's a later creation. You discover the original story by going back, looking at early texts, using the principle of uniformitarianism, using the principle of analogy, using anachronism, right? Using principle of dissimilarity, and then you figure out what the real story is. So whatever Islam says, whatever Muslims are saying, can't be true. It can't be true, because that's not how religions work. You're going to go and uncover the real origins. So what that means is there's just this refusal to accept that the Muslim narrative about the Quran's origins are true. Even though there's nothing, again, you can be an atheist, you can deny the Prophet of Muhammad, all these things. All the Muslims are saying is the Quran comes from the mid 7th century. That's it. But that's just unacceptable to some Western scholars who really are controlled and whose kind of worldview is suffused by the historical critical method and its origins. Okay, that's all I will say to you.
Angelica Newworth says in her book, The Cambridge Companion to the Quran, on the Wandsboro hypothesis, quote, "The presentation of Quranic developments in this chapter presupposes the reliability of the basic data of the traditional accounts about the emergence of the Quran. Assuming the transmitted Quranic text to be the genuine collections of the communications of the Prophet as pronounced during his activities at Mecca and again at Medina, it is true that the earlier consensus of scholarly opinions on the origins of Islam has, since the publication of John Wandsboro's Quranic Studies and Crone and Cook's Hagerism, been shattered, and that the various attempts at a new reconstruction of those origins have been put forward. As a whole, however, the theories of the so-called skeptic or revisionist scholar who, arguing historically, make a radical break with the transmitted picture of Islam, the picture of Islamic origins, shifting them in both time and place from the 7th to the 8th or 9th century, and from the Arabian Peninsula to the Fertile Crescent, have by now been discarded, though many of their critical observations remain challenging and still call for investigation." Essentially, she's rebuking this school of revisionism propounded by Crone, Cook, Wandsboro, Robson, and all these revisionists, saying that, look, you've been refuted. The evidence now completely refutes your hypothesis, which was, again, previously their consensus. I want you to understand that this was their consensus. Their consensus has been overturned. So this is a massive blow. Now, because these Orientalists failed at undermining the Quran is authentic. It comes to where the Muslims say it comes from. It goes back to the person who the Muslims say it goes back to. The variants are described the way that the Hadith portrays them. So they really have nothing to say about the Quran anymore, right? What they then do is try and shift the focus to Hadith and say, your Quran are authentic, but maybe we can attack Islam from the Hadith, saying the Hadith ain't authentic and the Hadith are back projected. So that's the next stop. But it's a symptom of a greater flawed methodology, which is that we need to undermine the Islamic tradition at all costs, get to the root of it. The scholars are, trying to deceive us, etc., etc., etc. All the stuff I spoke to you before, out of this polemical, this polemical ideology. Additionally, the Styometric Analysis of the Quran, the most rigorous one that has been done, concludes very, with certainty that the Quran has one author. One would conclude that the style-back hypothesis of one author. It also shows that Quran has one author. Now, if you want to go into more detail in stylometry, we can also do the same for Hadith, which I'll show a little bit later. Commenting on this, Dr. Joseph Lombard says, furthermore, the most extensive scientific textual analysis of the Quran to date, an analysis wherein the text is subject to rigorous stylometric, stylistic and statistical computer analysis, reveals that the Quran exhibits a high degree of concurrent smoothness, indicating that the style backs the hypothesis of one author. Such findings demonstrate that while Euroamerican Quranic studies has engaged in extensive speculation regarding the origin and authorship of the Quranic text, the classical Islamic tradition in treating the Quran as a coherent text by a single author has been much closer to examining the text as it arose within its original historical context. And this is still propounded by the likes of Shoemaker. He calls it, for example, a patchwork. He believes that the Quran had multiple authors and that there were these proto-Qurans that were then later stitched together. And he brings all kinds of weed and fabricated material to try and prove his hypothesis, misunderstanding. I mean, while we're here talking about Shoemaker, I might as well give you guys an example of the types of evidences he uses. So, for example, many of you will be familiar with the hadith where Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, he dies, and Umar is in denial about this, and he says, if anyone says Rasulullah died, I'm going to get upset with you, get angry with you. He's just gone back. He's gone to his Lord, and he'll come back. Abu Bakr comes out. And he out of the Prophet's house, and he says, "Wayhak ya Umar, calm down, Umar," and he recites the verse that Muhammad is just a prophet, a messenger. Many were the messengers who passed away before him. If he dies or is killed in battle, will you then turn your backs? And Umar says in this hadith, it's as if I never heard this verse being recited until I heard it from Abu Bakr. So Umar says, it's as if I never heard this verse until Abu Bakr said it. Now, Shoemaker takes this to be saying, again, by the way, Shoemaker believes all hadith are unreliable, right? But he uses this hadith to try and prove a Quranic forgery. He says, if Umar said he never heard it, then that means Abu Bakr is the one who, made up this hadith, because Umar said he never heard it. How could Umar not have heard it? This is his argument to try and prove, the Quran wasn't, a coherent text, or, it still wasn't put together, or, there were proto-Qurans, etc. This is his evidence, or part of his evidence at least. So the response is very simple. Umar is not saying that he never heard this verse before. He's just saying that I was reminded of it when Abu Bakr said it. That's all. But do you see how they twist the evidence and they read into it something that's not there? And by the way, do you see that the hypocrisy is on multiple levels? Not only is this guy misunderstanding the hadith he's citing, he doesn't even believe it's authentic to begin with. He thinks all hadith are fake, back projected, just nonsense. So why would you use nonsense to support your case? The thing is that they're happy to use it when it suits them, when it suits their hypothesis. All of a sudden now it's reliable. But when it doesn't suit their nonsense, when it refutes them, then, oh no, must be a Marwanid era fabrication. So this is the kind of examples that they use. So you can kind of get an idea of how laughable, these revisionist theories are. And if you want a good article refuting Lombard, there was a review article of his new book by Bruce, the scholar I cited before, where he refutes Shoemaker in extensive detail, and it's absolutely fabulous. I recommend you guys to read it. Actually, I might just I already have it up. Actually, I think let me get it up. Yeah, this one. So let me just zoom in while I'm here. So the review article is called Skepticism as a Method in the Study of Quranic Origins, a review article of Stephen J. Shoemaker's Creating the Quran, a historical critical study, right? And this is published in 2022 by Bruce Fudge. Now, in it, he completely destroys Shoemaker. He says that his method is completely inconsistent. He doesn't understand sources. He misrepresents sources. He just goes in great detail refuting Shoemaker. So I'm just going to find a few quotes that I find interesting to show you guys. 1 second. He says, for example, the reader cannot feel that Shoemaker, however he might object, has mistaken skepticism for a method, right? So again, he's commenting on his overly skeptical method, over reliance on negative evidence, etc., which is common to these revisionists. So I found one of the quotes I was looking for. He says here, our sources contain any number of accounts of things being added to or omitted from the Uthmanic Quran. Shoemaker strangely mentions very few. His arguments are based not on what the sources say, but on speculation, conjecture about what they do not say. Again, common to the revisionist school. Again, critiquing Shoemaker, he says, Shoemaker takes the Christian example, he gives no other, as the template and insists that the Islamic model must conform. Again, taking Christianity as a template and trying to back project their trauma on the Muslims. Another example here, he says, in short, he says this after refuting his misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the Islamic sources, because he misreads them, like the Jahil he is. You'll be surprised, these revisionist scholars, they don't even understand Arabic. I'm being genuine. If you ask them to read Surah An-Nas, they'll make mistakes. I'm not joking. But he says here, in short, there is no evidence whatsoever in the manuscripts to indicate Shoemaker's significant interventions. He says there's no evidence for his theory that Al-Hajjaj canonized the Quran or there's later Quran. No evidence for this at all. Let me just highlight that actually. Yeah. There's no evidence. Again, embarrassing. And finally, just to conclude here, he says, moreover, the latter view requires only that certain parts of the past were not mentioned or downplayed. The Shoemaker scenario, his hypothesis, requires wholesale fabrication on a scale that is hard to consider, let alone accept. The idea that from Al-Andalus to modern-day Uzbekistan, a nation, an empire that large, could cover up the fabrication or the interpolation of the Quran for 2 centuries is insane. He says this is hard to accept. And Donna, even though he's a revisionist, he also accepts this point. So does Mutsky, so does Brown. Again, complete nonsense. So this guy Shoemaker, he's essentially a racist. That's essentially what it is. Now, I'm not saying this to be pejorative or I don't like the guy. I don't know him personally, obviously. But I'm saying his methodology is one of racism, where he laments the idea that Muslims are in Islamic studies. And he says, oh, Muslims can't be objective when looking at their own history. So this is, what is this other than racism, than Orientalism? This guy is like the textbook example of an Orientalist. And yet you'll see clowns like, what's his name? Like David Wood or Chris from Speaker's Corner, the guy who I cooked, or Testify, citing these guys as some type of authority. When in reality, it's pseudo-scholarship. That's what it is. It's pseudo-scholarship. It's polemicism. It's there just to try and undermine the Islamic religion. It's not critical scholarship. All right. So I know that's a segue, but I don't really mean to get into that, but I think it's still worth explaining. All right. So on to the next slide. Sorry for the segue. The amount of work yet to be done is great, and the main paths of embarking on the tasks are clear. It is now equally clear that recent works in the genre of historical fiction are of no help. By historical fiction, I'm referring to the work of authors who contentedly ensconced next to the mountain of material in the pre-modern Muslim primary and secondary literature bearing on Islamic origins, say that there are no heights to scale, nothing to learn from the literature, and who speak of the paucity of evidence. Liberated from the requirement to analyze the literature critically, they can dream up imaginative historical narratives rooted in meager cherry-picked or irrelevant evidence, or in some cases, no evidences at all. So speaking of people like Shoemaker, Reynolds, etc., Joshua Little, these scholars, these revisionists who pass over the mountain of evidence, cherry pick evidence, or in some cases use no evidence at all to try and overthrow the Islamic narrative. They write off the mountain of evidence as the illusory product of religious dogma, or of empire-wide conspiracies, or of mass amnesia or deception, not realizing that the literary sources need not always be taken at face value to prove a point, or they simply pass over the mass of evidence in silence. And this is a very, telling summary of Quranic studies where it's at, where you have these 2 camps. You have the neo-traditionalists and the revisionist camps. You have people somewhere in the middle, I would say, and then you have the traditional scholars who pretty much rarely, if ever, actually interact with Western scholarship. All right, so now let's go, now that we've seen the colossal failure of Quranic studies and how badly the Orientalists have butchered that, let's jump to Hadith studies, right? And look and examine the historical critical method. So HCM, the historical critical method. So first of all, let's understand what is HCM, what are the assumptions of HCM, how does it work, and how do Orientalists use this to try and cast doubt on the Muslim tradition. So, for the Muslim tradition, the default stance is trust. I'm going to trust you until you give me a reason not to, right? For HCM, the initial position, the initial stance is doubt. A priori, before you look at any evidence, you should be doubtful. You should be skeptical, you should be suspicious. The role of the companions, according to the Muslim tradition, is that they're the best generation, they're morally upright. That doesn't mean that they weren't people who were sinful, or that they weren't people who lied, or anything like that. No, they can still be exceptions. But generally, overall, these people are trustworthy, these people are the best generation, and this is mentioned in the Quran. HCM doesn't have this theological dogma, let's call it that, or this belief. They believe that these people are just ordinary actors with ordinary interests that can ultimately be boiled down to social, economic, political interests, the same as everyone else, right? the view of miracles. Obviously, in the Islamic tradition, we grant that miracles are possible, not only possible, but necessary. HCM grants that these are a priori ruled out. You cannot appeal to miracles. You cannot appeal to the supernatural, right? This is a matter of methodology. It's not based on any evidence. They just assume these things. So they assume a priori doubt. They assume the principle of analogy, and they assume the lack of miracles. These are all assumptions. They're not. There's no evidence for this. If I ask, Shoemaker, what's your evidence of a priori doubt of Muslim sources? He's not going to give me evidence. He's just going to say, well, look, the Christians were fabricating stuff too. Therefore, we have a reason to suspect that the Muslims are also fabricating stuff. But this argument is fallacious. It's like saying, because your friend cheated on the math test on Monday, therefore you must have also cheated on the math test on Monday. Well, what's my friend and his interest got to do with mine? Similarly, if you ask them, what's the evidence for, getting into the minds of the companions? How do you know what they were motivated by? What's the evidence of that? They'll say, look, I can't really know. There is no evidence. We just assume that they're going to be, acting the same way that we act now. And that's an assumption. That's not anything that they can prove or show historically or empirically. Such is the same with miracles. They assume a type of naturalism, methodological naturalism when approaching history, and this is just an assumption. Again, it's not argued for, but it's taken to be the default stance. So that's fine. But you have to understand that these are assumptions, right? And oftentimes what happens is that these assumptions become dogma. How can you even challenge these assumptions? How can you doubt that Muslims, made up stuff? How can you doubt that the Sahaba had, ordinary interests? How can you doubt that there's a thing such as miracles? How can you even, challenge these assumptions? But that's exactly what we need to do. We need to challenge the assumptions of the method. Their hands are tied. This is the method that makes their hands tied. Whenever approaching our sources, before approaching any of our hadith, our seerah, our manuscripts, anything, they are bound by this method. Sinai is bound by this method, Shoemaker is bound by this method, Angelica Newworth is bound by this method. They're all bound by this method. Anyone who claims to be a historical, critical scholar is bound by this method. So, at a certain point, there should be a critique of this method, which was done by Brown. Though his critique was good, I would recommend you to read it, and I'm going to quote it here. He says, this is his book, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World by Jonathan Brown, talking about a priori doubt. He says, we thus find some important basic assumptions and methods that together make up the historical critical method of scholars in Europe and America. 1. Initial doubt about the authenticity or reliability of a historical text, a general suspiciousness towards orthodox narratives presented in the text, the conviction that by analyzing historical sources, a scholar can shift from the reliable from the unreliable by identifying which parts of the text serve which historical agendas. Along with the principle of analogy, the detection of anachronisms to identify unreliable reports, the HCM has also relied on a tool often referred to as the principle of dissimilarity, which states that a report that seems to contradict or challenge orthodoxy is probably originally true, since no one trying to construct that orthodoxy would have made it up. So again, these are some other secondary assumptions of the historical method, mainly that orthodoxy develops. They use the principle of dissimilarity, the principle of analogy, and they have a general, like I said, a priori doubt towards Muslim sources, and that, again, this goes back to what I was saying, point 3, that they believe that that the scholars are lying to them, and by sifting through the sources, the scholar can filter out what is historical from what is not historical. So the scholar is trying to deceive you. The job of the historian or the critical historian is to look through those sources in a critical way, cherry pick the parts that he thinks are reliable, and get rid of the parts that are not. That's generally the job of the historian, which we have no issue with per se, but we have an issue with how it's used and how they cherry pick, etc., etc. The rest of the stuff we have an issue with. There's no reason to be, suspicious towards orthodox narratives generally. What? Just because they're orthodox doesn't mean that you should be suspicious towards them. Just because the orthodox narrative of Christianity, is not historical, doesn't mean that the orthodox narrative of other religions is therefore also not historical. It doesn't follow. Again, but you'll find this type of reasoning, you'll find this kind of trauma, this baggage from their own history, constantly being back projected on us. Now, in terms of the principle of analogy, Nicholas Sinai says in his book, The Quran, A Historical Critical Introduction, on, I believe this is page 3, he says, what is the historical critical method? He goes on to explain the adjective. Moving on to the second constituent of the adjective historical critical, we may say that to read a text historically is to require that the meanings ascribed to it have been made humanly thinkable or sayable within the text's original historical environment, as far as the latter can be retrospectively reconstructed. At least for the mainstream of historical critical scholarship, the notion of possibility underlying the words thinkable and sayable is informed by the principle of historical analogy, which is the assumption that past periods of history were constrained by the same natural laws as the present age, that the moral and intellectual abilities of human agents in the past were not radically different from ours, and the behavior of past agents, like that of contemporaries, is at least partially explicable by recourse to certain social or economic factors. Assuming the validity of the principle of analogy has significant consequences. For instance, it will become hermeneutically inadmissible to credit scripture with a genuine foretelling of future events, or with radically anachronistic ideas, say with anticipating modern scientific theories, for example. The notion of miraculous and public divine interventions will likewise fall by the wayside. All of these presuppositions can of course be examined and questioned on various epistemological and theological grounds, but they arguably form core elements of the rulebook of contemporary historical scholarship. The present volume, whose concerns are not epistemological or theological, therefore takes them for granted. Again, what is Nicholas Sinai saying here? He's saying, look, we assume the principle of analogy. We assume that miracles are not possible. We assume that prophets cannot predict the future. We assume that the interests of the people of history, the Sahaba, the companions, must have been for some social or political or economic gain, at least in part. It has to be, right? And these are all assumptions. And we take them for granted. Now, you can argue with us on epistemological or theological grounds or on metaphysical grounds for why we shouldn't take these assumptions, but I'm taking them for granted, and the historical critical scholar takes them for granted, right? So he's being very clear that these are assumptions, and often, and this is, I praise him for this because he's being, transparent with his methodology, how it works, and he's explaining to us how we can critique him. Because he's giving us the target. He's telling you, look, if you want to critique our methodology, this is where you have to go. You have to talk about the epistemology and the theology and the metaphysic as well. You have to explain why your metaphysic is superior to theirs. And then it becomes a metaphysical discussion, an epistemological discussion, which is one that we're happy to engage with and happy to show why our epistemology and metaphysic is superior to theirs. And then that's a separate discussion. But often what they do is just assume, okay, my metaphysic is true, yours isn't. My epistemology is true, yours isn't. We should assume Western skepticism as the default, and we move on from there. And if you don't like it, you can leave. And this is ultimately what happens in, Western universities when you study Islamic studies, that you just have to kind of swallow it up. But this is what's known as epistemic colonization, because why should I assume your methodology is true? Why should I assume your epistemological theory of knowledge is true? Why should I grant you that? I have my own theory of knowledge. I have my own epistemology. I have my own metaphysic, right? So again, it all goes back to these fundamental assumptions. Once you understand this is where the real divide is, then you understand when two scholars can look at the same piece of evidence and come to radically different conclusions. This is why, because their assumptions are completely different. Right? And Nicholas Sinai here is just telling us what these assumptions are.
Alright, so that brings us to the conclusion of part 2. If you guys enjoyed and benefited from my work, make sure to leave a like and comment if you have any questions. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
شهابا يلهي بالأرض اشتعالا في غبار الحرب